Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting us to this conference. I think this conference is actually an excellent opportunity for us all to remember that HIV is not only an issue that belongs to Africa, to Asia, to Central Europe, but that HIV is a global issue that needs a global commitment, a commitment at, of course, global level, regional, and national level. The discussions we had yesterday showed very clearly that any commitment wouldn't do. We need to have an inclusive commitment, an all-encompassing commitment that takes care of all the key populations and not just the general population. We're talking about LGBTIs, we're talking about MSMs, we're talking about sex workers, we're talking about migrant workers, and so many others. So I am here today to give you an overview of ILO Recommendation 200, which was adopted in 2010. And it's important here to indicate that this is a legal instrument that has been adopted by the representatives of governments, workers, and employers from 185 countries after a participatory process that lasted 3 years and that included associations of people living with HIV, so civil society members, other UN agency members, etc. So what does this instrument bring to our discussion today? I think it's important to indicate that, as I said, Recommendation 200 is a legal instrument. It carries constitutional obligations for ILO member states. This is 185 member states. The obligations are that, first of all, this instrument should be presented to the parliaments of all the state members of the ILO. And under specific circumstances, countries can be asked to report on the efforts that were taken at national level in order to implement the provisions of this instrument. So Recommendation 200 is an instrument that protects the human rights at work for people living with or affected by HIV. It covers all workers under any form of arrangement, in any employment or occupation, in all sectors of the economic activity. It gives a very broad and inclusive definition of the workplace, which makes everywhere virtually a workplace. Everywhere where there is somebody performing an economic activity is workplace. The streets can be a workplace. The market is a workplace. The home can be a workplace. A brothel is a workplace. So it's very important to realize that we have a very broad and inclusive definition of the workplace. And this is due to the fact that all the member states of the ILO, when discussing and adopting this instrument, realized that they needed to reach out to all workers. And it is important also to know here that workers are not only those who are on the job, according to this instrument. Workers are those who are working, but the retrenched, people who are out of the job, who are in apprenticeship, all those who belong to the world of work are considered as workers by this instrument, which makes it very broad and all-encompassing. And of course, it includes the hard-to-reach populations, although they are not specifically mentioned in the instrument, and I'm going to talk about it a bit later. Why do we say that And based on what can we say that this recommendation includes key populations? Well, here is the definition that is given by UNAIDS when we talk about sex workers. We're talking about consenting people, adults, male, female, no matter their sexual orientation, who exchange sex for money or kind services or goods, who do that regularly or occasionally. And the occasionally is very important because many studies have proven that many people who engage into transactional sex do not necessarily associate themselves with this key population, sex workers, and yet they are. We do have in many countries today people who do pay for services using sex, no matter what the reasons are. For example, in Africa, you do have a lot of people, particularly women, who are too poor to pay in cash and would go to pay using sex services. Electricity bills are being paid like this. Water bills are being paid by this. I mean, from other perspectives, I mean, you would talk about corruption, but from our perspective, it is work. And this has nothing to do with moral judgment. It's just that it is something that we need to acknowledge. So definitely, sex workers are included in the recommendation, given the wide definition. But if sex workers were not to be included in this kind of, under the recommendation, probably it would be said. There is nothing in the recommendation that makes an exception, saying, for example, that sex workers or MSMs are not part of it. The discussions that led to the adoption of this convention for 3 years indicated very clearly that sex workers and MSMs and other key populations were part and parcel of the recommendation. So I think in terms of the terminology, we should be very, very clear and acknowledge once and for all, because all the time we are asked, is sex work an economic activity? Definitely it is. So long as you have a lot of men, women who exert this activity to be able to live, to take care of their families, send their kids to school, this is an economic activity. I'd like to come back to a few messages that I think are important that I'd like to share with you. I said this one already. I mean, sex work cannot be ignored. It would be completely, I think it would be a strategic error to say it doesn't exist. And we know what happens in many countries. It is denied. But whether we like it or not, whether it's legal or not, sex work is an economic activity. It has nothing to do with moral judgment. It is stating the facts. Based on the recommendation I just presented, sex workers are entitled to labor rights related to HIV as any other person, the right to have access to prevention, treatment, care, and support services, the right to have access to social protection, the right to have access to these kinds of benefits that the society offers to its members in order to help them absorb the shocks they can face in life. And so they must be protected like anyone else. You know, it was said so often yesterday that they operate in an occupation that is particularly exposed to HIV transmission. And it's not just HIV transmission. It also has a lot to do with stigma and discrimination and violence and all kinds of harassment. But one thing we always forget to say, because they are very much hidden, is that HIV prevention programs should also seek to reach out to male and transgender sex workers. And the reality we all know is that they receive even less funding. The other categories of key populations receive less funding, but these categories receive even less funding. The adoption of Recommendation 200 has brought a lot of hope and also a lot of disappointment among the sex worker community. The disappointment, the hope is that, oh, there is now an instrument that considers that we are part of the world of work. The disappointment was about why is it sex workers are not specifically mentioned in the convention, in the recommendation? Well, the ILO, and here it is on purpose I put organization into brackets, is that you have to make the difference between the International Labour Organization and the International Labour Office, which we represent as officials. And our job is to make sure that we implement the program, the mandate that has been designed by the organization, which is made up of the workers, employers, and governments of the 185 countries I just mentioned. So the ILO as an organization does not provide in any of its conventions a list of recognized occupations because it considers that it's at country level that this should be done. So it's for that reason that sex workers are not mentioned, but many others are not mentioned. None is mentioned except for the health workers because HIV is certainly for them a particular occupational hazard. So the organization can decide tomorrow to do otherwise, but for the time being, this is it. And the way it explains it is that if the conventions, the instruments were to list all the occupations, then we will end up with a document that is very difficult to manage. So we should also keep in mind that international labor standards are there to provide a framework, to provide a minimum standard for countries to use in putting their own national legislation in place. So it is not the officials' mandate, as we hear in so many conferences, to pronounce itself on the legality of sex work or any other occupation. The legality of sex work is determined at national level. And many of the activists that are in this room know that it's at country level that a national legislation can be changed. The international legislation provides a framework, provides an enabling environment for things to happen at national level. But I think what we should retain is that we shouldn't think too much about the disappointment. And by the way, my colleague from UNAIDS yesterday indicated very clearly that in the political declaration that was adopted by all countries on HIV in 2011, expressly indicates that sex workers are among the key populations. And you should not look only at one instrument, you should look at the broad environment created by all these instruments that creates the space for activities to take place. And I think this recommendation has contributed a lot to creating that enabling environment I was talking about. It provides an opportunity to change what we are facing today as challenges into opportunities. The movement of the sex workers is gaining global resonance. In the conference in Washington, the issue of sex workers and the need for them to be able to access HIV-related services on the same level as anyone else is something that has gained a lot of momentum. And I think it is through such actions at national level, at regional level, at international level, that progressively will come to this stage where at national level there is this willingness to open up to dialogue, in order to listen to the concerns of the various parts of the population. It is the responsibility of the countries, of the governments to do that. The ILO works in countries with sex workers where sex work is legalized or where sex work is tolerated. And we don't only look at the traditional HIV prevention efforts. We know now today that distributing condoms and providing information is not enough. It is very important to try to tackle the underlying factors that lead to risk-taking behavior, and this is what we're trying to do at country level. First of all, I think it's important that we realize that there is here a need to work upstream and downstream, at policy level and at operational level. And here are just a few examples of what we're trying to do. Direct interventions include providing sex workers through their organizations with training in order to extend their alternative business skills, in order to provide them with more choices as to what is the best way they would like to lead their lives. And we do that in many countries that are indicated here. We do provide economic empowerment opportunities through our partners, our donor countries, through revolving funds, access to credit, and so on and so forth. And they're creating access to income. Very rapidly, I was recently in Zimbabwe where I met a group of young ladies who were in sex work. And thanks to an ILO project in SIDA, Sweden, they were able to access some training and to start businesses. And they decided to now start a laundry business. And they were telling me that the funny thing is that their clients haven't changed. Their clients are still the same truck drivers along the transport corridor where they are working. The difference is that the services have changed because they chose to move away from sex work to something else. But this is a choice that we do respect. For those who choose to remain in transactional sex, we say the same thing. They are entitled to the rights everybody else is entitled to. In terms of the indirect interventions, I said we work upstream. One thing I didn't say enough in this presentation, I guess, is that whenever the ILO works with sex workers, it also works with its clients. And sex workers' clients are in every economic activity, every economic sector. So it's for that reason that the ILO insists a lot and works with the companies to have workplace policies in place, providing them with the basic services and also information. We also target directly sex workers and their clients in particular economic sectors where we know the HIV transmission risk is higher. And we also provide orientation and training to healthcare providers because they do play a very important role. They are the gate through which discrimination and stigma can be reduced substantially. And it's for that reason we are targeting on them. But we also do provide training to labor inspectors. We provide training to labor judges. And we provide training to the communities. And this is just to give you a snapshot of the kinds of things that we're doing. And one thing I'd like to end up with is that we belong to the UN family. And the UN family calls for countries to enact and enforce legislations outlawing discrimination against people living with HIV. This has been reminded to us very clearly by our colleague from WHO yesterday. So we are part of a global effort, but nothing happens actually if there is not a solid, broad alliance at country level with activists, policymakers, in order to make things change. This morning, on the screen, we saw this wonderful campaign by the GAP on the condom use. And I retained this sentence, eficaz cuando usado. I think it's the same thing for the recommendation. Thank you very much.